Hey there, neighbors. Just a quick request before we jump into the episode. I've been posting a lot more short form content on places like Instagram and TikTok, and then reposting that stuff to places like Threads and X and Facebook. So if you would, go to the podcast website, www.neighborontheleft.com, and in the contact section, all the social media links are there. Stop on over and check out some of the short form content. It tends to be a bit more lighthearted, at least some of it, more comedic than the heavy podcast episodes. But I would love to have you stop by, and if you'd be so kind to like and follow what you see. Thank you very much. And on to the episode. Indicted for securities fraud, impeached by members of his own party, accused of corruption by his own senior aides, investigated by the FBI, accused of helping wealthy donors, sued by whistleblowers. And after all of that, Donald Trump endorsed Ken Paxton for the United States Senate. Now, years ago, not even that long ago, honestly, that kind of resume would have ended a political career. Not slowed it down, not bruised it a little. Ended it. Political obituary. Career toe tag. Cable news people standing around in dark suits talking about whether the party can recover from this. But that is a place where we don't live anymore. Because something has changed in American politics, and I don't think enough people are really grappling with how much it's changed. We keep talking about scandals individually. This indictment, that ethics investigation, this controversy, that allegation. But I think we're missing the bigger picture. The bigger picture is that we now have an entire political movement where scandals don't matter anymore, as long as the person involved stays loyal to Donald Trump. And on the flip side, people who do break with Trump, even staunch conservatives, even lifelong Republicans, even deeply right-wing Republicans, those are the people who get treated like traitors. And think about how upside down that is for just a second. A politician can survive impeachment, they can survive corruption allegations, they can survive investigations, they can survive behavior that would have vaporized a political career 20 years ago. But disagree with Trump publicly, question him, refuse to fall in line, suddenly that becomes the unforgivable sin. And it's a pattern that you can't help but see, because this isn't just hypocrisy anymore. It's a completely different moral system. Greetings, neighbors, and welcome to a Friday edition of Back Porch Files from your neighbor on the left, the podcast where we talk about progressive politics, human decency, and life on the blue side of America's ideological divide. My name is Don Spielis, and I am your host. And today we are going to be talking about the key to political success in the Republican world, the endorsement of Donald Trump. But more specifically, we're going to talk about how much things have changed in the past 20 years in regards to what disqualifies a person from success as a Republican candidate or a candidate in general, and what doesn't disqualify them. There was a time in American politics when public shame still had political power. And I know some people hearing that are immediately saying to themselves, well, politicians have always been corrupt. Sure, of course. I'm not sitting here pretending that the 1980s was some magical kingdom where, every senator rode to work on a unicorn and had the Constitution under one arm and the Bible under the other. Politics has always involved ego and corruption and ambition and hypocrisy and backroom deals, all of it. But there used to be a line, or at least the perception of one. There used to be consequences tied to public embarrassment. Politicians feared scandal because voters expected them to fear scandal. Richard Nixon resigned over Watergate because even Republicans eventually reached the point where they couldn't publicly carry the water anymore. His own party cracked. The pressure became too much. Republicans finally looked at him and basically said, dude, you gotta go. Try and imagine that happening today. Seriously. Can you even picture it? Picture a modern MAGA Republican turning on Trump over corruption or abuse of power allegations. You can't even visualize it. Your brain rejects the image like a bad organ transplant. And that's the point. Somewhere along the way, political shame just died. Not all at once. It didn't happen overnight. It happened gradually, like Americans sitting in a pot while the water kept getting hotter and hotter and hotter. You had Gary Hart in the 1980s, presidential frontrunner, serious candidate. Then the affair, the scandal hit and his campaign disintegrated. Well, remember Howard Dean? He screamed weird one time, and the media treated it like he'd transformed into some malfunctioning robot on live television. Dan Quayle misspelled potato, and people acted like the man had attempted to eat the Declaration of Independence. And some of this was stupid, obviously. Some of it was media overreaction, no doubt about it. Some of it was unfair, but the larger point is that politicians understood something pretty clearly. Public humiliation was dangerous. Now, scandal just sort of floats by. It's like weather. Oh, look, another indictment. Oh, wow, another ethics investigation. Another whistleblower accusation. And everybody just keeps on scrolling. Part of that is exhaustion. We live in a constant avalanche of outrage now. Every day is 12 breaking news stories fighting each other in a Walmart parking lot. But I think something deeper changed too. Politics stopped being primarily about standards and started becoming about tribes and tribal warfare. And once politics becomes tribal warfare, people stop asking, did my side do something wrong? And they start asking, will admitting this help the other side? That's a completely different framework. Because if politics feels existential, you genuinely believe the other side is destroying America. And then almost anything becomes justifiable in defense of your tribe. You start grading your own side on a curve. You start rationalizing and minimizing, and you move the goalposts, sometimes like they're on wheels. And eventually you end up in a place where things that would have been politically radioactive 20 years ago don't even really register anymore. And Donald Trump didn't invent this dynamic entirely, but he absolutely weaponized it better than anybody else in modern American politics. Trump understands something that traditional politicians didn't, or I guess they didn't before. Traditional politicians feared scandal. Trump figured out you could survive scandal if you convinced your supporters that every scandal was actually persecution. And that was a breakthrough. It was like a cheat code for the software. Every indictment, witch hunt. Every investigation, it's the deep state. Every criticism, fake news. Every whistleblower is a traitor. Every former ally is now disgruntled. Every institution is corrupt, of course, except him. And once people emotionally buy into that framework, accountability is almost impossible, because now evidence itself gets filtered through loyalty. That's why Trump can endorse somebody like Ken Paxton, and huge portions of MAGA world barely blink. Not because they necessarily believe that the accusations against him are false. A lot of them probably don't even know all the details. It's because the moral calculation has changed. The question isn't, is this person ethical? The question is, are they on our side? That's the test. And once that becomes the test, scandal loses meaning, certainly loses power. There used to be career-ending scandals. Now there are just temporary news cycles. And honestly, if you wanted to design the perfect stress test for this whole theory that I'm talking about, you'd probably end up accidentally inventing Ken Paxton. Because this guy's political history reads less like a Senate resume and more like, the previously on segment before like a season finale of a legal drama. And yet, somehow, politically, he just keeps on surviving. Not thriving quietly either, surviving loudly. That's the fascinating part. Now, look, I want to be careful here, because I think sometimes political commentary turns into this machine gun blast of accusations where, people stop processing the actual weight of what's being discussed. So I want to slow down for a minute and actually walk through this. Ken Paxton was indicted back in 2015 on felony securities fraud charges. Felony charges. The allegations centered around accusations that he misled investors and failed to properly register as an investment advisor. Now, regardless of where somebody lands legally on the final outcome of the case, let's just stop there for one moment, because there was a time in Republican politics where merely being indicted would have been catastrophic. Can you imagine the Republican Party of the Reagan era rallying around a guy who was under felony securities fraud indictment and them saying, "This is our dude, let's move him up the ladder"? Not a chance. Conservatives used to love talking about character, responsibility, ethics, personal accountability. They wrap themselves up in that language constantly. Hell, Republicans spent decades branding themselves as the party of law and order. And now, a felony indictment barely slows down fundraising. That's the shift, and Paxton's story doesn't stop there. Not even close. In 2023, the Republican-controlled Texas House impeached him. Not the Democrats, not the radical left, not, college students with blue hair and pronouns in their bios. Republicans, conservatives, members of his own party. And that matters, because MAGA media has this habit of framing every scandal involving Republicans as though it materialized out of thin air from some underground liberal lab, beneath a vegan coffee shop. But Paxton's impeachment came from Republicans looking at the evidence and saying, this is bad enough that we can't ignore it. The allegations included bribery, abuse of office, and using the Attorney General's office to benefit wealthy donor Nate Paul. And the details here, they get really ugly. According to the allegations and testimony surrounding those impeachment proceedings, Paxton was accused of intervening in legal matters connected to Paul, pressuring staff, and using public office in ways that appeared designed to help a political ally and donor. And again, this isn't an MSNBC section. These accusations were coming from inside his own party. And maybe the most staggering part of the whole thing is the whistleblower situation. 8 senior aides in Paxton's own office reportedly went to the FBI with corruption concerns. Now, think about how extreme that is for a second. People inside your own administration, people who work for you, deciding, nope, we need federal investigators involved. That is definitely not what you'd call normal political disagreement. That's not somebody getting cranky because they lost an argument in a meeting. That's your own people effectively pulling the fire alarm. And yet, MAGA world largely processed all of this the same way it processes basically everything now, through that lens of loyalty. It wasn't, did this happen? It wasn't, should this concern us, or is this disqualifying? It was just, whose side is he on? That's the entire operating system now. And the Nate Paul stuff really highlights how upside down all of this has become, because conservatives used to talk endlessly about corruption, cronyism, and insider favoritism, the political elites, quote unquote, helping their wealthy friends. You remember all the outrage about the swamp? We don't hear that word so much anymore, but it was all the rage for a while. The movement that came to Washington screaming about corruption, and now it routinely treats corruption allegations like parking tickets, as long as the accused person is loyal to Donald Trump. That's, I guess, what's so surreal about this. The values didn't evolve. The standards didn't deepen. They just got replaced. And then there's Paxton's role in trying to help overturn the 2020 election, which by itself should have been politically radioactive. The guy joined efforts challenging election results in swing states won by Biden. The Supreme Court rejected the case, but the point here isn't whether the lawsuit technically succeeded. The point is that large chunks of the Republican Party crossed a line after 2020 that previous generations of conservatives would have considered absolutely unthinkable. This was the party that used to lecture everybody else about respecting institutions, respecting constitutional order, respecting law and law enforcement and the rule of law. And suddenly they lost an election. And then all of those values became weirdly flexible. It's funny how that worked. And after all of this, after the indictment and the impeachment and the FBI allegations, after the whistleblower lawsuits and the corruption accusations, even after the election subversion efforts, Donald Trump endorsed Ken Paxton for the United States Senate. Not despite all of it, almost in defiance of it. Like the endorsement itself was a message, and honestly, I think it was, because Trump's endorsement increasingly doesn't function like traditional political endorsement anymore. It functions like absolution. Like a king tapping somebody on both shoulders with, the ceremonial sword and declaring, "Thou is forgiven." That's why this stuff keeps happening, because in modern MAGA politics, loyalty washes away almost everything. And I want to mention another thing, that for the sake of the length of this episode, I didn't even include all of the shady and, scandal adjacent things that Ken Paxton has been tied to. I really suggest that you Google his name and read up on the guy, because what I've talked about is only part of the puzzle. But anyway, here is where the whole thing really starts to reveal itself. Because if this were just about corruption or just about scandals or just about Republicans circling the wagons around their own people, that would still be ugly, but it wouldn't necessarily be unique. Political tribes protecting their own is unfortunately not new. But MAGA politics has added another layer to it. And that layer is this: the people who seem to face the harshest punishment inside the movement are not the people accused of misconduct. It's the people accused of disloyalty. That's a whole nother animal. That's the thing that should make people deeply uncomfortable. And as an example, take Thomas Massie. Now, Thomas Massie is not exactly, AOC with a beard. This guy is one of the most conservative members of Congress. Pro-gun, hard-right libertarian streak, anti-spending, anti-establishment. The kind of Republican who probably thinks Ronald Reagan drifted too far left on some of his things. And yet even Massie became a target once he stopped aligning with Trump consistently enough. Trump backed efforts against him and attacked him publicly and treated him like a problem. Not because Massie suddenly became a liberal, not even close. Not because he abandoned conservative ideology, because he committed the ultimate sin, independence. And that should tell you a lot. Because if ideology were truly the central thing holding MAGA together, somebody like Massie would be untouchable. But ideology increasingly comes second. Personal loyalty is paramount. Now, the day I'm recording this episode, right now it's the 19th, news just broke that Massie has been primaried by the candidate that Trump endorsed. So his career as a Republican congressperson has an expiration date now. He will be done at the end of this session. And again, not because he changed his ideologies in any way, but because he didn't play nice with Donald Trump. And we've seen this pattern over and over and over again. Look at Liz Cheney. Now, if I'm going to be honest, I disagree with Liz Cheney on almost everything politically. I'm not trying to sneak her into, the Progressive Hall of Fame here by any stretch. The woman is deeply conservative. But her actual political exile inside the Republican Party came not because of corruption, not because of scandal, not because, she had some giant position change or some ethical collapse. It came because she openly opposed Trump and acknowledged reality about both January 6th and the 2020 election. And that was enough. That crossed the line. Now think about the contrast there for a second. Ken Paxton faces corruption allegations from his own aides and gets elevated. Liz Cheney criticizes Trump and becomes radioactive. That's not normal party discipline. It's something much deeper. And Mitt Romney got the same treatment. Again, not a liberal, not a Democrat. Mitt Romney was the Republican nominee for president in 2012. The guy practically looks like he was grown in a laboratory designed to manufacture Republicans. Square jaw, corporate hair, permanent expression of a man mildly concerned about, quarterly earnings. And yet once Romney consistently criticized Trump, huge sections of MAGA started treating him like he was an infiltrator, a traitor, a rhino, the enemy. And if you think about that historically, it's very bizarre. A Republican presidential nominee became more hated in parts of the Republican base than politicians accused of actual misconduct because he refused to kneel before Trump politically. That's the pattern. That's the thing underneath all of this. And it's, these are just a few examples. It's everywhere because MAGA politics increasingly operates less like a traditional ideological movement and more like a loyalty hierarchy. There's a reason Trump can insult people publicly for years and humiliate them and attack their families. And then many of those same people eventually crawl back into alignment once he endorses them or welcomes them back into the fold. As examples, I give you Marco Rubio. I give you Ted Cruz. Just to name two. Because access to Trump became the political currency. Approval became currency. Forgiveness became currency. What this honestly reminds me of sometimes? Those old mob movies where everybody knows the boss is corrupt. Everybody knows the system is dirty. Everybody can see how terrible things are actually happening. But the only thing you absolutely cannot do is publicly break loyalty. That's the cardinal sin. And before any conservatives who might actually be listening start clutching pearls over that comparison, think about the language that gets used inside the MAGA spaces. Traitor, backstabber, disloyal, those words come up constantly. Words you don't hear are things like unethical or corrupt or unqualified. Just disloyal. Because that's the real moral framework now. And honestly, this is where the hypocrisy starts becoming virtually impossible to ignore. This movement spent years branding itself as the movement of law and order and family values and constitutional principles, moral clarity, personal responsibility. Hell, just Donald Trump's marital history alone would have disqualified him as a serious Republican candidate 25 years ago. But that's not what triggers outrage now. None of those things. A Republican gets indicted. It depends whether Trump likes him. Republican gets accused of corruption. It depends whether Trump likes him. Republican gets caught in a scandal. Depends whether Trump likes him. But a Republican criticizes Trump publicly. Nuclear launch. That's the line. That's the thing that gets people politically destroyed. And the more this pattern repeats, the harder it becomes to pretend that this is still fundamentally about anything related to conservatism in the traditional sense. Because conservatism, at least theoretically, revolves around ideas and principles. This increasingly just revolves around a person. And when a political movement reorganizes itself around loyalty to a single leader instead of anything resembling consistent standards, accountability is gone. And once you see how this system works, you start noticing how incredibly selective the outrage becomes. Because the Republican Party under Trump hasn't just become more tolerant of scandal. It's become selectively tolerant. That's the key distinction. There's almost this invisible immunity shield that forms around people once they're identified as loyal soldiers of the movement. Like they've been issued some kind of, political diplomatic passport. And one of the clearest examples of that was Matt Gaetz. Now, again, the specifics of investigations and allegations matter legally. Due process matters. I'm not trying to play internet mob prosecutor here, but politically, publicly, the sheer number of controversies surrounding Gaetz over the years would have absolutely annihilated politicians in previous eras. Sex trafficking investigation, ethics investigations, allegations involving payments to women, drug accusations floating around his orbit, constant scandal clouds hanging over him like, that cartoon rainstorm that just follows you as you go. And yet large portions of MAGA continue treating him not as damaged goods, but as a warrior. Why? Because he fought aggressively for Trump. That was his qualification. That's the thing that overrides everything else. The modern Republican Party increasingly treats scandal the way, medieval kings treated court jesters. Annoying, occasionally embarrassing, but perfectly acceptable as long as they remain loyal to the throne. And you really see the hypocrisy explode when you get into the so-called family values crowd. Because for decades, conservatives hammered Democrats over morality. They lectured America endlessly about traditional values and personal responsibility and sexual morality and protecting children and, preserving the sanctity of marriage. These are the same people who acted like Bill Clinton personally caused the collapse of civilization, or at least Western civilization, because he couldn't keep his pants zipped in the 1990s. But now suddenly character is optional, or at least selectively optional. Look at Herschel Walker. Walker ran wrapped in the language of family values and conservative morality while simultaneously facing allegations and controversies that, directly contradicted that image that was being sold to the voters. And none of it seemed to matter all that much inside of MAGA because Trump supported him. That's the thing that keeps happening. The old standards don't disappear completely. They become conditional. You know, it didn't matter if Herschel Walker was a deadbeat dad. It didn't matter, what his relationship with his children were. It just mattered that Trump liked him. Now, the old standards didn't disappear completely. They just became conditional, flexible, portable. Like one of those inflatable two men outside a used car dealership that just flails around depending on which direction the wind blows that day. And before somebody says, well, both parties are hypocritical. Sure, politics is full of hypocrisy. But there's a difference between ordinary political hypocrisy and what we're seeing now. Ordinary hypocrisy is like, my side sometimes fails to live up to its stated values. This is becoming my side's values instantly reshape themselves around whatever protects the leader and his allies. And if you don't see that as different, I don't know what to tell you. It's different. It's much deeper. And then there's Mark Robinson, which honestly feels less like normal politics and more like somebody fed an internet comment section into a particle accelerator. The controversies surrounding Robinson have included inflammatory rhetoric, extremist comments, bizarre statements, comments about slavery, grotesque online postings, stuff that in older political eras would have ended campaigns in a heartbeat. Not weakened them, ended them. And yet Trump still praised him. Still supported him, still treated him as politically acceptable because at some point ethics stopped being a measuring stick. Tribal usefulness became a measuring stick. That's the real transformation. The question is no longer, would this behavior disqualify somebody? The question is, does this person adore Donald Trump? That's it. That's the entire game now. And, once you start operating that way, something really dangerous is bound to happen psychologically. People begin emotionally processing criticism of their politicians as attacks on them personally. That's why scandals bounce off so many of these guys right now, because defending the politician becomes tangled up with defending personal identity. I've talked about this numerous times before. Religious identity, cultural identity, community identity. For a lot of people, admitting somebody like Paxton or Gaetz might actually be corrupt doesn't feel like just changing your mind. It feels like betrayal. It feels like surrendering territory to the enemy. And Trump understood this dynamic better than almost anybody. He figured out that if you can convince supporters that all criticism is politically motivated persecution, then every criticism, every investigation actually reinforces loyalty instead of weakening it. That's why indictments become fundraising tools. That's why scandals become proof of victimhood. That's why ethics investigations become attacks from the deep state. Everything gets folded back into the same narrative. And honestly, one of the strangest parts of this whole era is watching people who once screamed nonstop about moral collapse suddenly become incredibly philosophical about corruption as long as the accused politician says the right things. And by that, I mean the right things about Donald Trump. You hear lines like, we're all sinners. Nobody's perfect. Politics is dirty. It's all witch hunts. It's funny how the flexibility always seems to kick in at exactly the right moment. Because in modern MAGA politics, scandal doesn't necessarily remove your immunity. Just disloyalty does. Now, at this point, whenever you criticize MAGA hypocrisy, somebody inevitably pops up, like a wind-up toy and goes, yeah, well, it's both sides. And listen, Democrats absolutely have scandals. Of course they do. Politicians are human beings, and human beings suck by and large. Many are corrupt. Some are selfish. Many are reckless. More than we used to think are predators. Some are narcissists. Some are all 5 before breakfast. So this is not me standing here pretending Democrats are morally pure, woodland elves floating through Washington handing out universal health care and ethically sourced granola bars. That is not the argument. The argument is that the reaction to the scandal increasingly looks radically different between the two parties. And I think that's the important part, because Democrats honestly sometimes turn into a firing squad when one of their own gets accused of misconduct. Think back to Al Franken. You can remember him, and if you don't, look him up. But now, personally, I still think a lot of Democrats regret how quickly Franken got pushed out. I think many liberals believe there should have been a fuller process, more nuance, more proportionality. But politically, what happened? The allegations surfaced, and these were, allegations of the Me Too variety, and not the Me Too level of Harvey Weinstein, but in that general area. So the allegations surfaced, and the Democrats immediately started distancing themselves. Major Democratic figures called for resignation. The pressure built quickly and overwhelmingly, and Franken was gone. Again, whether somebody thinks that was fair or unfair is almost secondary to the point that I'm trying to make. The point is, Democrats demonstrated a willingness to politically cannibalize one of their own over scandal. Now compare that to the Republican response to somebody like Ken Paxton. One guy gets pushed out, the other guy gets endorsed for the Senate. That is not both sides. That's a completely different, political immune system. And you've seen it again with Andrew Cuomo. Cuomo was one of the biggest Democratic stars in the country for a while. During COVID, Democrats were practically treating him like America's angry Italian dad, giving nightly cable news lectures from the kitchen table. Then the harassment allegations surfaced, and what happened? Democrats started turning on him. Pressure mounted, calls for resignation grew, and eventually he resigned. Again, you can debate the fairness, the due process, the political motivations, and all of that. But the mechanism still functioned. The scandal produced consequences. Now, compare that to MAGA Republicans rallying around people under indictment or impeachment or ethics violations and corruption allegations or whatever, and acting like the criticism itself is actually the real scandal. And let's not forget Anthony Weiner. Good Lord. Anthony Weiner's political career didn't just collapse, it exploded like a fireworks warehouse. Democrats didn't rally around him as some persecuted victim of the media. They didn't launch a movement called, Justice for Anthony. They didn't insist every allegation was fake. They didn't say it was manufactured by, some secret anti-Weiner cabal operating beneath, CNN headquarters. His career was over. Finished, radioactive. And of course, the most recent example of this is Eric Swalwell. He was, Democratic politician. He was running for governor of California, and allegations surfaced, campaign suspended, resignation follows. Democrats begin creating distance from him almost immediately. And again, I have to say, compare that to what happens inside MAGA. Because inside MAGA politics, the instinct increasingly seems to be protect first, question later, if ever. That's asymmetry. These are the things that I think of when I hear the both sides are corrupt argument. One party frequently overreacts to scandal. The other party increasingly behaves like scandal itself is fake unless Trump personally disapproves of the accused. And honestly, I think this dynamic has become so normalized that people don't even stop to appreciate how historically weird it is. Think about the message being sent here. Eric Swalwell resigns, Ken Paxton gets promoted. Andrew Cuomo resigns, Matt Gaetz becomes a MAGA celebrity. Al Franken resigns, Mark Robinson still receives praise and support despite, tons of controversy after controversy after controversy. At a certain point, you're not looking at isolated incidents anymore. You're seeing a pattern. And again, I've said this many times before, you need to look for patterns. Patterns are what tell you things. And the pattern says something ugly. It says one political movement still appears capable, at least a lot of the time, of feeling embarrassment. The other increasingly treats embarrassment as weakness. That's a huge difference. Because shame, for all of its problems, actually serves a social purpose sometimes. It creates boundaries. It tells people, no, that behavior crossed the line. But what happens when political movements stop enforcing any boundaries? What happens when every scandal gets reframed as persecution? What happens when accountability itself becomes suspicious? You get a political culture where all that matters is loyalty, not conduct, for sure. And once that happens, anything can be rationalized. That's the dangerous part. The hypocrisy is galling, but the ability to rationalize increasingly bad behavior is the dangerous part. Every political movement has hypocrisy. The dangerous part is when hypocrisy becomes systematic enough that it replaces the standards altogether. And this is where the whole thing starts becoming, I hate to say it, almost darkly comedic, because while all this is happening, while indictments and corruption allegations and ethics scandals keep getting waved through like, the TSA agent is asleep at the conveyor belt, MAGA outrage somehow remains fully operational for the dumbest culture war nonsense imaginable. I mean, seriously, think about the stuff that triggers absolute 5-alarm emotional meltdowns in right-wing media ecosystems. Bud Light cans, M&M's not being sexy enough anymore, Dr. Seuss books and Disney movies and pronouns, Starbucks holiday cups, Target displays, a freaking tan suit, a president eating Dijon mustard, a football player kneeling. You would think America was under attack by an elite strike force of communist, puppeteers armed with rainbow flags. The emotional intensity is unbelievable. Conservative influencers make 12-minute emergency videos because a cartoon candy wore sneakers instead of high heels. Meanwhile, actual corruption allegations hit one of their politicians and suddenly everybody turns into a philosophy professor. Well, hold on now. Nothing's proven. Both sides do it. We should wait for all the facts. Really? That's when you employ caution? Now you're nuanced? Now you're worried about rushing to judgment? Very interesting timing. Because these are often the same people who spent years screaming that drag queens reading books in libraries represented the collapse of everything moral in the universe. But securities fraud indictments, abuse of office allegations, who among us is without sin? Attempts to overturn election results, well, a lot of people thought there were irregularities. It's impossible not to see the double standard unless you're actively trying not to see it. And honestly, one of the reasons this frustrates people on the left so deeply, at least this is my opinion, is because conservatives spent decades branding themselves as the moral adults in the room. That was their whole image. Republicans, were the party of responsibility and values and ethics and patriotism and the party of law and order. Democrats were painted as, unserious, chaotic, morally loose, anti-American, corrupt coastal weirdos who, drank wine in art galleries and, thumbed their nose at the real America. That was the branding. And now the same movement that spent years acting like, Bill Clinton scandals represented, some moral apocalypse. Suddenly they treat corruption allegations like background noise, as long as Trump likes the person involved. The same people who lectured America endlessly about, respecting law enforcement spent years attacking the FBI, the courts, the prosecutors, the judges, the election officials, basically every institution when they contradicted Trump. The same movement screaming about family values rallies around candidates drowning in personal scandal because apparently owning the libs is now a sacrament that washes away all those sins. That's what makes this feel less like just ordinary political hypocrisy and more like a complete moral shape-shifting. Standards don't apply consistently anymore. They are absolutely selective. And selective morality is not morality. It's branding. That's what this feels like. Political branding. The values become costumes you put on when convenient and you throw in the trunk when they start to itch. And look, hypocrisy in politics is old, ancient. Human beings are hypocrites. Every ideology has people who fail to live up to their values, but there's a difference between people failing their principles and the principles themselves becoming completely abandoned in order to, pump up one political figure. That's MAGA. That's the leap MAGA made. Because loyalty to Trump has become the highest value, and every other value is negotiable. Law and order, well, it depends on whether Trump approves. Free speech, well, that depends on who's speaking. Patriotism, well, that depends on who's criticizing America. Fiscal conservatism, who's doing the spending? Christian morality, well, that all depends on who's cheating on their wife, right? Constitutional principles, well, that depends on whether the Constitution is trying to keep our guy from doing something we want him to do. Everything becomes flexible. Everything is situational. Everything bends around the gravitational pull of Donald J. Trump. And honestly, one of the best metaphors I can think of for the modern MAGA outrage is airport security. MAGA outrage works like TSA if TSA was absolutely insane. They'll tackle somebody carrying a toothpaste tube that's half an ounce too large, while a guy dragging a flamethrower walks through security waving at everybody, and everyone just nods because he's got the right hat on. That's what this feels like. Endless hysteria over nonsense, endless forgiveness over actual abuses of power. And over time, that kind of selective rage does something corrosive because people stop believing standards are real and they start believing standards are just weapons used against enemies and ignored for allies. And can you blame them? That's what we see almost every day. And once enough people start believing that, I mean, trust in institutions, what is that anymore? And this is a point where I think people need to stop treating all of this like just another ugly phase in partisan politics, because this goes beyond the hypocrisy. It goes beyond, the whole Republicans bad. It goes beyond Trump and the accusations of Trump derangement syndrome. What we're talking about here is the slow erosion of accountability inside one of the two major political parties in the United States. And that matters. It matters a lot because democracy only functions if political movements maintain some sort of internal standard. Not perfection, not sainthood, just standards. There has to be some point where a party says, this is too much. This is a step too far. There has to be some mechanism that punishes unethical behavior. Because if there isn't, corruption just metastasizes. And I use that word intentionally, metastasizes, because it behaves a lot like corruption behaves a lot like a cancer. If it stops encountering resistance, it spreads. more politicians learn what they can get away with. More opportunists enter the system. More ethical people either leave or stay quiet. And eventually, the culture changes. That's dangerous. The culture changes. You stop attracting leaders who value integrity and start attracting performers who understand the real requirement is loyalty. I mean, that right there is system decay. Not all at once, gradually, through incentives. And MAGA politics increasingly creates an incentive structure where protecting Trump matters more than protecting any institution. That's why Republicans who defend the Constitution against Trump get treated worse than Republicans accused of misconduct while they defend him. I mean, think about how insane that sentence would have sounded 15 years ago. A party that once wrapped itself entirely in constitutional rhetoric now frequently treats constitutional restraint, as a hurdle or a weakness if it inconveniences Trump politically. That is not a small transformation. And it's possible, I think, that one of the most dangerous things Trump normalized was teaching millions of Americans to distrust every institution except him. The courts are rigged. The media is fake. Elections are rigged. FBI weaponized. Justice Department, deep state. Military leaders disloyal. Civil servants, traitors. Republican officials who disagree with him, rhinos. At a certain point, the message becomes only Trump can be trusted. And that's as dangerous as it is ridiculous. Because democracies are built on institutions being bigger than any individual person. That's the entire point. Presidents are supposed to come and go while the constitutional system survives around them. But personality cult politics flips that whole thing upside down. The leader becomes the center of gravity. Then the movement stops asking what are our principles and starts asking what does the leader want. That's why the position keeps changing so rapidly. You ever notice that? Conservatives used to be deeply skeptical of executive power expansion when Obama was president, and suddenly under Trump, executive power is just fantastic. Then Biden wins, and executive overreach becomes tyranny again. And then Biden's out and Trump is back in, and now we don't want limits on executive power again. The principles don't remain stable anymore because the principles are really aren't steering the vehicle. Trump is. That's why so many Republicans who privately disagree with him still publicly fall in line. Chris Christie gave an interview, I think it was on Bill Maher, where he talked about how a lot of the most Trumpian Republican politicians will say things to him off camera that let him know that they don't really believe what they're saying on camera about Trump. They just know they have to say it because they understand the political consequences. The punishment mechanisms are clear. If you disagree publicly, you get targeted. If you question him, you get primaried. If you break ranks, you're labeled disloyal, and that's the end of the story. And meanwhile, people accused of actual misconduct continue receiving protection if they stay inside the loyalty structure. That kind of political culture eventually hollows institutions from the inside because when loyalty becomes the highest value, competence doesn't matter. Ethics matter even less. Truth, forget it. Reality itself starts mattering less. Only alignment matters. And before somebody says, well, Democrats worship politicians too, I don't believe that. I don't believe that. Barack Obama was one of the most popular politicians in any party in my lifetime. And you didn't see thousands and thousands of people with his face on t-shirts and his slogan on hats and bumper stickers and flags and so on and so on and so on. There is a difference between support and adoration. There is a difference between support and obedience. There's a difference between I really like this politician and this politician defines truth itself. That's where things go off the rails. I think lots of Americans still don't fully appreciate how abnormal this all is historically, especially younger voters. A major political movement in the United States increasingly operates according to a system where loyalty overrides scandal and criticism becomes betrayal, and institutions are universally suspicious and ethical standards are ultimately flexible, and the leader is the central moral reference point. That is not healthy from a democracy standpoint. That's the kind of dynamic democracies are supposed to guard against. Because once political parties stop functioning like coalitions organized around ideas and start functioning like personal protection squads for one guy, you're in dangerous territory. And no, I'm not saying America is going to turn into North Korea next week. Some people hear criticism like this and immediately jump to the most dramatic possible interpretation. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying democratic erosion usually looks gradual. It looks like normalization. It looks like people getting used to things they once would have considered unacceptable. It looks like standards quietly dying one compromise at a time. And that's exactly what this era feels like. And here's the thing that really keeps sticking in my head about all of this. Movements reveal what they truly value by what they're willing to forgive. The slogans are nice, the campaign ads get attention, convention speeches with giant flags and country music swelling in the background. Somebody's filming a truck commercial for freedom itself. But what they tolerate, what they excuse, what they decide is no longer disqualifying. These are the things that really reveal a movement or a party. And right now, the Republican Party under Trump is sending an incredibly clear message to me. You can survive scandal. You can survive corruption allegations. You can survive impeachment. You can survive ethics investigations, indictments. You can survive behavior that would politically incinerate people 20 years ago, as long as you stick with Trump. But if you criticize him, if you refuse to participate in this loyalty ritual, that is where the trapdoor opens beneath you. That's the pattern. And really, I think that's why so many former Republicans and conservatives have become alarmed over the last several years. Not because, they suddenly turned a liberal overnight, but because they recognize the movement itself is changed. This isn't the grand old party anymore. The old Republican Party had plenty of flaws. Plenty. Trust me. God knows I've spent enough time criticizing them. But at least there was still some visible distinction between, conservatism, constitutionalism, party loyalty, and loyalty to an individual politician. Trump has blurred all of that together. And now huge parts of the movement treat attacks on Trump as attacks on truth. And what could be more dangerous? Not just politically. Culturally, once people become emotionally conditioned to excuse almost anything from their own side while they treat dissent as betrayal, how is there accountability? And accountability is one of the only things standing between a democracy and outright rampant corruption. Accountability. That's the whole point of it. A healthy political movement asks, is this person ethical? Are they honest? Are they competent? Can they be trusted with power? A cult of personality only asks, are they loyal to the leader? That's the difference. And before conservatives get angry and insist this is unfair, ask yourself something honestly. What would happen tomorrow if Ken Paxton publicly turned against Trump? Stop and think about that for a moment. Of all the horrible things that he's been involved with, what would happen if tomorrow he turned on Trump? Do you honestly believe that MAGA media would suddenly keep defending him the same way? Do you think all of the scandals would still be considered irrelevant? Or would every single one of those controversies suddenly become very important overnight? I think we all know the answer. And that is the entire point. The scandals themselves are no longer the deciding factor, just Trump's approval. That's the moral framework now. That's the political operating system now. And no matter how many flags people wave or how many times they say the words law and order or constitutional conservative, a movement that forgives almost anything except independence is not operating on principle anymore. It's operating on loyalty. And in modern MAGA politics, scandals don't end careers. Disloyalty does. All right, everybody, thank you so much for taking the time to download and listen to this episode, this installment of Back Porch Files from your neighbor on the left. I am so grateful that you did, and I'd like to hear from you. I'd like to hear what you have to say about this topic. I want to get your feedback on this and anything, honestly, critiques, compliments, questions, whatever it is you have. You can go to the website, neighborontheleft.com, go to the contacts page, and either send me a message through one of the social media platforms, or you can use the email address and email the podcast directly. While you're there, go to the episodes section and you can download or stream any episode of the podcast going all the way back to the beginning. And you can go to the blog section and you can see the post for this particular episode, as well as posts that go with other episodes, and they include the sources that I use for my information. I think that's very important these days, is to know where the source of the information comes from. I hope everybody has a good weekend. We'll be back on Monday with another episode of Your Neighbor on the Left. So between now and then, stay engaged, stay kind, and have the kind of week you'd wish for others.